Tonight, we're exploring the long and complex story of the Cyprus conflict. For decades, this Mediterranean island has been caught between different communities and outside powers, shaping a history marked by struggles, negotiations, and a lingering divide. It's a tale of cultural identity, international diplomacy, and a quest for lasting peace that continues even today. So, before we all get nice and comfortable, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know the time and location from which you are watching. Now, let's dive into this fascinating and often overlooked chapter of the Mediterranean, and we hope it helps you learn while you sleep. Nestled in the eastern Mediterranean, the island of Cyprus has long been a crossroads of civilizations. Its strategic location, just south of Turkey, west of Syria and Lebanon, and north of Egypt, made it a prized possession for empires throughout history. Phoenicians, Assyrians, Egyptians, Persians, Romans, Byzantines, Venetians, and Ottomans all left their mark. But beneath the layers of culture and conquest, a divide slowly deepened, one that would eventually erupt into conflict. By the late 19th century, Cyprus had been under Ottoman rule for more than 300 years. But in 1878, through a secret agreement, control of the island was handed over to the British Empire, while the Ottomans retained nominal sovereignty. Following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, Britain formally annexed Cyprus in 1925, transforming it into a crown colony. It was during this period of British rule that two distinct national identities began to crystallize: the Greek Cypriots, who formed the majority and identified culturally and politically with Greece, and the Turkish Cypriots, who saw their future aligned with Turkey. Tensions simmered under the surface, and although most Cypriots initially tolerated British governance, political aspirations began to grow. For many Greek Cypriots, the dream was clear: enosis, or union with Greece. Inspired by the Greek War of Independence and nationalist movements sweeping through the Balkans, enosis became a rallying cry. Political leaders, educators, and even members of the Orthodox Church called for self-determination. In 1931, a Greek Cypriot revolt broke out, the October Revolt, which was quickly suppressed, but it marked a turning point. The British responded with stricter colonial controls and banned political parties. Meanwhile, the Turkish Cypriot minority, wary of being absorbed into a Greek state, gravitated toward a countervision, taksim, or partition, the idea that the island should be divided between Greece and Turkey. Though not immediately widespread, the notion of partition grew as Greek Cypriot demands for enosis intensified. By the time World War II ended, the winds of decolonization were sweeping through the world. In Cyprus, this meant a renewed push for enosis. In 1950, the Orthodox Church organized a referendum on union with Greece. Over 95% of Greek Cypriots voted in favor, though Turkish Cypriots and the British ignored the results. The demand had become impossible to ignore. The British government, struggling to maintain control over a shrinking empire, proposed limited reforms. But to Greek Cypriot nationalists, half measures were not enough. And so, in 1955, the conflict turned violent. A Greek Cypriot guerrilla group, AOKA, Ethniki Organosis Kyprian Agonistin, launched a campaign to drive the British out and achieve enosis. Led by Georgios Grivis, a former Greek army officer, AOKA targeted military installations, police stations, and political opponents. The British responded with curfews, mass arrests, and internment camps. Caught in the middle were the Turkish Cypriots, who began forming their own paramilitary groups in response, most notably the TMT, Turk Mukavmet Tezkilati, with the backing of Turkish officials. What had begun as a war for independence against colonialism was now morphing into a civil conflict, shaped by ethnic fears and geopolitical rivalry. By the late 1950s, Cyprus was a land on edge, not just between empires, but between communities. British troops patrolled villages torn by sabotage and reprisals. Greek and Turkish Cypriots, who had lived side by side for generations, now eyed each other with suspicion. Peace would come, but not through enosis or taksim. The road to independence, and further turmoil, was just ahead. By the late 1950s, Cyprus found itself in a vortex of colonial unrest, ethnic mistrust, and mounting violence. The AOKA campaign for Enosis raged against British colonial authority, while Turkish Cypriot groups organized for Taksim, fearing dominance by a future Greek-led Cyprus. This turmoil caught the attention of the international community, eventually forcing a solution that aimed to keep the island unified, independent, and free from the overshadowing influence of both Greece and Turkey. The breakthrough came in 1959, with the signing of the Zurich and London agreements. Under these accords, brokered with the help of Britain, Greece, and Turkey, Cyprus would become an independent republic, neither joined to Greece nor partitioned between the two ethnic communities. The compromise was delicate, reflecting the uneasy balance of power and suspicion among all parties. On August 16, 1960, the Republic of Cyprus officially came into being. Its constitution, painstakingly negotiated, established a bicommunal state. The president was always to be a Greek Cypriot, elected by the Greek Cypriot community, and the vice president a Turkish Cypriot, elected by the Turkish Cypriot community. Each group held separate electoral roles and distinct voting rights. Government ministries, civil service positions, and even security forces were allocated proportionally between the two communities. On paper, it was a carefully crafted arrangement meant to ensure communal equality. In practice, the system was riddled with veto provisions, power-sharing mandates, and mutual suspicion. Britain, Greece, and Turkey each retained the status of guarantor powers, with the right to intervene if Cyprus deviated from its constitutional order or threatened regional stability. For a brief moment, hope reigned. Streets in Nicosia, the island's capital, filled with celebrations. Greek and Turkish Cypriots alike watched the British Union Jack lowered and the new Cypriot flag raised. Flags of Greece and Turkey fluttered side by side in official ceremonies, symbolizing a fragile unity. Yet beneath the pomp, the seeds of discord had not vanished. Almost immediately, tensions arose over the practical application of the constitution. Greek Cypriot leaders found the elaborate checks and balances cumbersome, slowing down governance. Turkish Cypriots insisted on strict adherence to constitutional safeguards, worried that any erosion of their guarantees would lead to marginalization. Then, in 1963, President Macarius III, a key figure in the island's spiritual and political life, proposed 13 amendments to the constitution, amendments that would remove or reduce many of the Turkish Cypriot veto powers. Turkish Cypriots viewed these proposals as a direct assault on the delicate bicommunal balance. Negotiations failed, and the constitutional crisis deepened. By December 1963, violence erupted in Nicosia. Street clashes between Greek and Turkish Cypriots escalated into widespread unrest, leaving dozens dead and entire neighborhoods segregated. The once mixed suburbs became front lines. Roadblocks appeared overnight. The Green Line, a makeshift boundary dividing Nicosia, was drawn by a British officer with a green marker on the map, a line that still exists today as the island's capital remains split. In 1964, the United Nations stepped in, deploying a peacekeeping force known as UNFICYT. Its mandate was to prevent further fighting, stabilize the island, and facilitate negotiations. But peace proved elusive. Sporadic violence continued. Turkish Cypriots withdrew from many state institutions, citing security concerns and discrimination. In isolated pockets, they formed enclaves protected by makeshift barricades and local militias. Meanwhile, outside powers hovered, each with its own agenda. Greece offered covert support to Greek Cypriot forces, while Turkey threatened military intervention to protect its kin. Britain, caught between its colonial legacy and guarantor responsibilities, urged restraint. The dream of a unitary, independent republic was unraveling. Cyprus stood at the crossroads of domestic rivalries and geopolitical interests, a fragile experiment that, less than 4 years after independence, was already collapsing under the weight of communal distrust. Yet the conflict was far from resolved. More storms lay ahead, fueled by shifting alliances and the enduring question, could two proud communities share one island without breaking it apart? By 1964, the once hopeful Republic of Cyprus was mired in a simmering crisis. Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots eyed one another with deepening distrust, while United Nations peacekeepers patrolled streets scarred by barricades and sporadic gunfire. The constitution, designed to balance power between the two main communities, had collapsed in practice, leaving President Macarius III's government functioning almost solely on Greek Cypriot support. In the countryside, villages split into enclaves. Checkpoints sprang up along dirt roads. Turkish Cypriots in rural areas grew anxious, fearing encirclement and isolation, while their leadership urged greater autonomy. Meanwhile, radical Greek Cypriot factions called for a more forceful approach to secure enosis, or union with Greece, insisting that any compromise only postponed the island's destiny. Clashes erupted near mixed towns like Famagusta and Paphos, prompting calls for calm from moderates on both sides, but few listened. Amid the chaos, UNFICYP, United Nations peacekeeping force in Cyprus, struggled to maintain order. Authorized in 1964, it aimed to prevent a full-scale civil war, enforcing ceasefires and investigating skirmishes. Canadian, Swedish, British, and other international troops established observation posts around hot spots. Their presence, while a deterrent in some areas, was not enough to quell all violence. Reports of kidnappings, arson attacks, and sniper fire persisted, intensifying the cycle of retaliation. Outside powers hovered like uneasy guardians. Greece discreetly supported elements of the Greek Cypriot National Guard, with some officers pushing for a more aggressive stance against Turkish enclaves. Turkey, for its part, threatened intervention under its guarantor rights, sending signals that any harm to Turkish Cypriots would be met with force. Ankara quietly supplied arms to Turkish Cypriot militias, hoping to bolster their defenses against potential aggression. In Washington, policymakers watched the situation with growing concern. The Cold War cast a long shadow. Both Greece and Turkey were crucial NATO allies. A conflict between them over Cyprus risked fracturing the alliance's southeastern flank, potentially opening the door for Soviet influence in the Mediterranean. American diplomats worked feverishly to broker talks and calm tensions, deploying special envoys to Nicosia, Athens, and Ankara, but progress was elusive. At the same time, Macarius explored international support beyond NATO channels. He turned to non-aligned countries, meeting figures like Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, who saw parallels between Cyprus's anti-colonial struggle and broader Arab nationalism. For Turkey, this confirmed suspicions that Cyprus might seek alliances detrimental to Western interests, another reason to keep an eye on the island. By 1967, violence flared again. That year, a Greek-backed coup in Athens brought to power a military junta, which signaled it would support a final push for enosis. Macarius, wary of being manipulated, resisted open alignment with the junta. Meanwhile, Turkish Cypriots entrenched in enclaves worried that a direct Greek military intervention could turn them into targets overnight. The island's small population bore the brunt of these escalating tensions. Farmers found roads to markets blocked by rival militias. Children traveled to school under armed escort. Religious festivals turned into flashpoints. Fear seeped into daily life, and families on both sides of the communal divide began leaving for Britain, Australia, or the United States, seeking stability far from the bitter feud. Despite sporadic peace talks and proposals for constitutional reform, deep wounds remained unhealed. Each skirmish, each rumor of atrocities, only hardened resolve. The notion that Greeks and Turks could coexist under a single government seemed increasingly distant. With regional powers pulling strings from afar, and local leaders locked in a cycle of retaliation, Cyprus appeared on the brink of a new calamity. The stage was set for further upheaval, as the very guarantors meant to protect Cyprus teetered on the edge of confrontation themselves. In April 1967, a group of Greek colonels seized power in Athens, overthrowing the elected government and imposing a harsh military dictatorship. This regime, widely referred to as the Colonels' Junta, had a far-reaching effect on Cyprus. The junta believed that the destiny of the Greek world lay in outright union with the island, intensifying existing calls for enosis among Greek Cypriots. However, Archbishop Macarius III, President of the Republic of Cyprus, was determined to safeguard the island's delicate sovereignty from any foreign manipulation, be it Greek, Turkish, or otherwise. At first, tensions stayed hidden behind diplomatic courtesies. The junta, busy quelling dissent in Greece, postured as champion of Greek Cypriots' aspirations. Yet it considered Macarius, with his measured approach, more of an impediment than a partner. Meanwhile, Macarius, aware of the ongoing intercommunal friction, feared that a hasty push for Enosis could ignite worse violence against Turkish Cypriots. Balancing all sides demanded careful diplomacy that often collided with Athens's more aggressive stance. Throughout this period, Turkish Cypriot enclaves remained under their own local administrations, guarded by militias and observed by UN peacekeepers. The Greek Cypriot-led government made limited efforts to address the Turkish community's concerns, but mistrust remained. Turkey repeatedly threatened intervention under its guarantor rights if events moved too close to full union with Greece or if Turkish Cypriots' safety was threatened. Meanwhile, Western diplomats, wary of a larger NATO crisis, urged both sides to avoid escalation. In 1971, AOKA, dormant since independence, resurfaced under a radical banner called AOKA B, led by Georgios Grivis. Funded quietly by the junta, AOKA B launched violent attacks to force immediate Enosis. They labeled Macarius a traitor for negotiating with foreign powers and refusing to fulfill the Hellenic dream. As bombings and assassinations grew more frequent, Macarius found himself squeezed between militant nationalists on one side and Turkish intervention fears on the other. By 1972, the island's political climate was fraught with paranoia. Rumors circulated of Greek officers infiltrating the National Guard to undermine Macarius. Turkish Cypriot leaders, especially Rauf Denktaş, expanded administrative structures within enclaves, anticipating potential partition should conflict reignite. The United Nations force in Cyprus, UNFICYP, kept patrolling, but minor skirmishes, blockades, and intercommunal shootings persisted, eroding any lingering trust. Events in Athens also cast a long shadow. The colonels cemented an authoritarian regime, stifling dissent while parading nationalist fervor about a greater Greece. They viewed the Cyprus question not as a nuanced issue of bicommunal rights, but as an unfinished chapter of Greek history. Macarius, an adept political figure, tried to maintain a working relationship with the junta, yet openly resisted any measure that could spark war with Turkey or inflame the island's precarious peace. The colonel's government, in turn, saw him as an obstacle blocking the final step toward Enosis. By 1973, signs of deepening crisis were everywhere. AOKA B's attacks on police stations and government offices in Nicosia escalated. Public life grew tense, with daily arrests, kidnappings, and neighborhood raids. The Turkish Cypriot side, watching from entrenched enclaves, anxiously noted each outbreak of violence. Politicians in Ankara reiterated warnings of military intervention if Turkish Cypriots faced an existential threat. As the Greek junta, weakened by internal strife and international isolation, clung to power, Cyprus teetered closer to the edge. The question no longer was whether a showdown might come, but when and how violently. Throughout it all, Macarius tried to steer a precarious course between the extremes. In 1974, the fragile threads holding Cyprus together would finally snap, unleashing a tragedy that would change the island forever. By 1974, the tension in Cyprus had become a ticking time bomb. President Macarius III, walking a perilous tightrope between Greek Cypriot nationalists and the Turkish Cypriot minority, found himself increasingly isolated. The Greek junta in Athens, unwavering in its desire for Enosis, viewed his cautious policies as betrayal. On the island, extremist groups like AOKA B pursued their own violent goals, determined to force union with Greece. That summer, events in Athens took a decisive turn. The colonel's regime, still floundering under international pressure and internal dissent, saw an opportunity to reshape Cyprus in their image. They believed a swift coup could install a more pliant leader, one who would push forward with Enosis once and for all. And so, clandestine plots were set in motion. On July 15, 1974, Greek Cypriot members of the National Guard, heavily influenced by junta sympathizers, stormed the presidential palace in Nicosia. Tanks and armored vehicles rumbled through the city streets before dawn. Gunfire and explosions rocked the capital, catching civilians off guard. Radio broadcasts soon announced that Macarius was dead, an unsubstantiated claim. In reality, the Archbishop-President had narrowly escaped, fleeing to safety via a network of supporters and sympathetic soldiers. Macarius's whereabouts remained unknown for days, stoking confusion. Meanwhile, the junta's hand-picked figure, Nikos Sampson, a newspaper publisher known for his extreme nationalist views, was declared the new president. This move was meant to solidify Greece's control over the island. But it triggered fury in Ankara and alarm in the international community. Turkey, which had long warned it would intervene if the status quo or Turkish Cypriots' security were threatened, now deemed the coup a clear violation of the 1960 Treaty of Guarantee. It signaled that Enosis might be imminent. Within days, Turkish leaders prepared for military action, concluding that diplomatic protests alone could not halt Sampson's regime or protect Turkish Cypriots. On the island, chaos reigned. Clashes between coup supporters and Macarius loyalists broke out in several regions, while many Turkish Cypriots feared a new crackdown or worse. UN peacekeepers tried to maintain order, but the situation deteriorated too quickly for them to manage. Reports emerged of arrests, beatings, and summary executions of those viewed as threats to the new government. Behind the scenes, Britain and the United States scrambled to defuse the crisis. Britain, still a guarantor power, mulled whether to intervene militarily, but opted instead for diplomacy, reluctant to re-entangle itself in the island's internal affairs. Washington, preoccupied with Cold War concerns, wavered on how to respond, hoping to maintain ties with both Athens and Ankara within the NATO framework. As the island braced for the worst, Macarius surfaced. In a dramatic radio broadcast from Paphos, he denounced the coup as an invasion by Greek officers, and called for international assistance. His voice resonated with many Greek Cypriots who saw the coup as a betrayal of democracy. Meanwhile, Sampson's regime insisted it had liberated the island from Macarius's compromised rule, accusing him of undermining the Greek cause. Tension soared. Within a week of the coup, Turkish patience ran out. As the Sampson government failed to allay Turkish fears of Enosis, Ankara concluded that a show of force was the only option left to protect the Turkish Cypriot minority and preserve the island's fragile balance. The moment of reckoning arrived on July 20, 1974, when Turkey would launch a full-scale intervention. By then, Cyprus had plunged into its worst political crisis since independence, and a new, more devastating conflict was mere hours away. At dawn on July 20, 1974, Cyprus awoke to a new reality. Turkey had launched a military operation, codenamed Operation Attila. As the first Turkish paratroopers dropped from planes over the northern coast, landing near Kyrenia, and naval vessels appeared off the shoreline, it was clear that decades of tension and days of crisis had culminated in a game-changing moment. The Turkish government justified its intervention by invoking the 1960 Treaty of Guarantee, claiming it was acting to protect the Turkish Cypriot community and uphold the island's constitutional order, overturned by the recent coup against President Macarius III. For Ankara, the swift action was necessary to prevent an imminent enosis that would place Turkish Cypriots at risk under the new Greek-dominated regime. On the ground, the Turkish operation caught many off guard. Helicopters ferried troops inland from the beachhead. Tanks and armored vehicles rolled through coastal villages, establishing a corridor to Nicosia. Turkish jets roared overhead, bombing strategic points and claiming control of the skies above northern Cyprus. Panic spread among Greek Cypriot soldiers, many still reeling from the coup mere days earlier. The Nikos Sampson government in Nicosia denounced the intervention as an invasion, calling for international help and urging mobilization. Greek Cypriot National Guard units scrambled to defend the north, but coordination was lacking. Confusion reigned. Some units remained loyal to Sampson, others sought to restore Macarius, who, from his refuge abroad, condemned both the coup and the Turkish assault, insisting he was still the island's legitimate leader. Amid the chaos, Turkey consolidated gains around Kyrenia. By July 22, Just 2 days into the operation, Turkish forces had secured a narrow corridor linking Kyrenia to the northern edge of Nicosia. The landing zone, once established, allowed reinforcements and supplies to pour in. Turkish Cypriots, who had been isolated in enclaves, welcomed the troops as liberators. For them, this was relief from the fear of Greek-led repression. Internationally, shock waves rippled. Britain, also a guarantor power, contemplated intervening but hesitated. Prime Minister Harold Wilson opted for diplomacy, hoping to bring about a ceasefire without direct involvement. The United Nations Security Council, facing another crisis, demanded an immediate end to fighting. The United States, meanwhile, was preoccupied with the Cold War, uncertain how to respond to an internal NATO clash between Greece and Turkey. On July 22, a UN-brokered ceasefire was announced. Fighting slowed but didn't stop entirely. Turkish forces had established a solid foothold in the north, though they had not yet achieved complete objectives. The Samson regime was in disarray. Many Greek Cypriots saw Samson's leadership as illegitimate and recognized the fiasco it had triggered. Amid mounting pressure, Samson resigned on July 23, replaced by a provisional president, Glafkos Klarides. But the crisis wasn't over. Turkish leaders demanded strict adherence to the island's original 1960 constitution, including full security guarantees for Turkish Cypriots and a possible reconfiguration of territorial control. Greek Cypriots argued that Turkey's intervention was a flagrant violation of sovereignty. Talks between the two sides, under international mediation, began but stalled quickly. In Turkey, public support for the intervention was widespread, framed as rescuing kinsmen under threat. In Greece, the coup regime in Athens collapsed on July 24, leading to the restoration of democratic governance under Constantine Karamanlis. Many Greeks blamed the junta for the disaster in Cyprus. As July drew to a close, the island teetered on the brink of deeper disaster. Thousands had been displaced, Greek and Turkish Cypriots alike, fleeing battle zones. With each passing day, the existing ceasefire frayed, and new skirmishes erupted. Cyprus would soon learn that the worst was not behind it. A second wave of conflict was about to erupt, overshadowing the fragile peace and forever altering the island's map. As July 1974 ended, Cyprus stood precariously between a shaky ceasefire and renewed violence. The Turkish intervention, launched on July 20, had secured a foothold in the north, but peace talks brokered by the United Nations hung by a thread. The world hoped that diplomacy might prevail and prevent further bloodshed. But beneath the hopeful rhetoric, tensions only escalated. Turkish leaders demanded guarantees for Turkish Cypriots that went well beyond the enclaves. Greek Cypriots, reeling from the failed coup and facing an occupying force, insisted on a withdrawal and restoration of Cyprus's sovereignty. Within the new government in Nicosia, voices clashed. Some favored negotiation, others prepared for a desperate defense. Into this atmosphere stepped Glafkos Klarides and Ralph Denktis, each trying to represent their community's interests. Negotiations in Geneva saw Greek Cypriot officials calling for the island's territorial integrity, while Turkish officials pressed for a federal solution or partition, ensuring strong autonomy for Turkish Cypriots under Turkish protection. Mediation efforts by Britain and others yielded vague proposals but little concrete progress. On August 14, 1974, frustration in Ankara boiled over. Claiming that the talks had failed and that Turkish Cypriots remained vulnerable, Turkey launched a second offensive, often called Attila II. This time, the aim was not merely securing a narrow corridor but capturing a substantial swath of territory across the northern third of Cyprus. Tanks and infantry surged southward from their Kyrenia stronghold, backed by artillery and air support. Greek Cypriot forces, already battered and disorganized, could not mount a coordinated defense. Civilians fled by the tens of thousands, cramming into cars or leaving on foot with whatever belongings they could carry. Towns like Famagusta, Morphu, and Kyrenia fell quickly. In some places, resistance was fierce, but it was no match for the superior Turkish firepower. In Nicosia, firefights erupted as Turkish units pushed into the city's northern districts. UN peacekeepers again tried to impose a ceasefire, but soon found themselves powerless to halt the full-scale fighting. Reports of massacres and forced expulsions circulated, deepening the spiral of fear. Many Greek Cypriots believed the offensive was an attempt at outright partition, a fate they had long dreaded. Over the course of a 2-week offensive, Turkish forces extended their control to roughly 37% of the island. By August 28, a new Green Line, different from the haphazard one drawn in 1963, had emerged. This line cut through Nicosia, turning the old city into a patchwork of abandoned shops, barbed wire, and militarized zones. Greek Cypriots who found themselves on the wrong side of the line fled or were displaced. Turkish Cypriots moved north, leaving decades of mixed neighborhoods behind. The toll on civilian life was immense. Over 200,000 Greek Cypriots were displaced, becoming refugees in their own country. Turkish Cypriots, for their part, gravitated toward areas under Turkish control, creating almost ethnically homogeneous sectors for the first time in centuries. Families who had once lived side by side, neighbors for generations, now found themselves separated by armed checkpoints and bureaucratic barriers. On August 16, another ceasefire took hold, but the damage was done. Cyprus lay physically divided, with the north administered by Turkish Cypriot authorities under Turkey's military presence, and the south governed by the internationally recognized Republic of Cyprus. In the months that followed, tens of thousands of homes sat empty, left behind by fleeing owners, while new occupants arrived from Anatolia or from Turkish Cypriot enclaves. International reaction ranged from condemnation to appeals for peace. The United Nations Security Council demanded respect for territorial integrity, but no power intervened to reverse the situation. Greece, still recovering from the junta's collapse, lacked the capacity for a military showdown. Britain remained hesitant, and the U.S. was absorbed in Cold War priorities. Thus, by the autumn of 1974, Cyprus had been effectively partitioned. A line of barbed wire and watchtowers ran across the island, signaling that the conflict had entered a new, more permanent phase, one of stalemates, frozen diplomacy, and lingering heartbreak. With the Second Turkish Offensive in August 1974, the conflict in Cyprus reached a grim new phase. The island was effectively partitioned along a militarized frontier. Tens of thousands of Greek Cypriots fled their homes in the north, leaving behind farmland, villages, and family graves. In the south, Turkish Cypriots consolidated areas under their own control, forging a separate existence with Turkish support. The aftermath of the fighting was stark. Over 200,000 people found themselves uprooted, turning the Mediterranean paradise into a land of barbed wire, abandoned houses, and broken communities. Many Greek Cypriot refugees, who had once lived in towns like Famagusta or Morphu, struggled to adapt to new settlements in the southern part of the island. Meanwhile, Turkish Cypriots in enclaves across the south moved north, forging a demographic realignment that would endure for decades. Inside the new status quo, a swirling mix of resentment, grief, and uncertainty took hold. The Republic of Cyprus, still recognized internationally as the island's sole legal government, cried foul over Turkey's military presence and the forced displacement. Turkey insisted it had acted under the Treaty of Guarantee to protect the Turkish Cypriot minority from Greek dominance. Neither side found common ground, even as the United Nations tried to broker a settlement. In 1975, the Turkish Cypriot authorities declared the establishment of the Turkish Federated State of Cyprus in the north, hinting at a possible federation with the south. But negotiations moved slowly, hindered by mutual distrust. Greek Cypriots demanded the right of return for refugees, full withdrawal of Turkish troops, and the restoration of territorial integrity. Turkish Cypriots insisted on political equality, security guarantees, and recognition of their breakaway administration. Abroad, the conflict drew condemnation but little effective intervention. The UN peacekeeping force, UNFICYP, remained on the island, patrolling the Green Line, dividing Nicosia and managing sporadic flare-ups. Diplomatic proposals by Britain, the United States, and other concerned actors circulated, but none gained traction. Over time, the confrontation hardened into a frozen conflict. overshadowed by other global crises. For ordinary Cypriots, life was transformed. Greek Cypriot refugees formed entire suburbs around Nicosia and Limassol, living in prefabricated housing or with relatives. They carried old keys and deeds, dreaming of returning to their homes in the north, even as the years passed. Turkish Cypriots, many resettled from rural enclaves, adjusted to lands newly vacated by Greeks. The sense of loss on both sides deepened, fueling historical grievances that would pass to the next generation. Meanwhile, economics took separate paths. The South, with its recognized government and open markets, rebuilt quickly through tourism, shipping, and foreign investment. The North, reliant on Turkey, faced international isolation, trade embargoes, and limited recognition. The fundamental imbalance in resources and status cemented the island's division, making any push for reunification politically challenging. Yet in the background, quiet voices advocated for reconciliation. Some Greek and Turkish Cypriots yearned for a future beyond barbed wire and bitter memories. Bicommunal groups formed, fostering cultural exchanges and dialogue. Even so, the trauma of war, displacement, and loss cast a long shadow. By 1977, negotiations between President Makarios and Turkish Cypriot leader Rauf Denktaş resumed, exploring a federal solution. Hopes flickered, yet the chasm remained wide. The events of 1974 had carved deep lines across Cyprus's map and psyche. Healing would prove elusive, as the island pressed onward, divided yet unwilling to abandon the dream of a shared tomorrow. By 1977, Cyprus had been split for 3 years. A ceasefire line, barbed wire, abandoned homes, and UN watchtowers etched a division across fields and through towns, binding Greek Cypriot South and Turkish Cypriot North in a tense standoff. Occasional gunfire still punctuated the nights, but large-scale violence had subsided. Diplomacy, however fragile, took center stage. That year, a brief moment of hope emerged when President Makarios III and Turkish Cypriot leader Rauf Denktaş met under UN auspices. They agreed in principle to a federal, bicommunal solution, where each community would retain significant autonomy. But definitions were vague, and trust remained scarce. Soon after, Makarios died unexpectedly in August, ushering in a new chapter of leadership under his successor, Spyros Kyprianou. Kyprianou continued negotiations, yet progress stalled. The Greek Cypriot side insisted on territorial adjustments, returning a large portion of northern land for Greek Cypriot refugees. Turkish Cypriots demanded equal political status and robust security guarantees. External forces influenced the debate. Greece backed reunification with safeguards for Turkish Cypriots, while Turkey supported a two-state approach, albeit framed as a loose federation. As the 1980s dawned, Cyprus's political landscape hardened. In 1983, the Turkish Cypriot administration declared itself the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, TRNC, recognized only by Turkey. The international community condemned the move as illegal secession. For Turkish Cypriots, it symbolized a bid for self-determination under partial blockade and global non-recognition. For Greek Cypriots, it was confirmation of a creeping partition, an affront to sovereignty. On the ground, life settled into an uneasy routine. In the south, the Republic of Cyprus developed a robust economy fueled by tourism, shipping, and foreign investment. Nicosia, Limassol, and Larnaca grew into bustling modern cities. Greek Cypriot refugees found new homes, though many still clutched old keys to properties left behind. In the north, the TRNC faced isolation. Dependent on Turkish aid, its infrastructure lagged. A trickle of settlers from Anatolia moved into vacated Greek homes. Tensions brewed between native Turkish Cypriots and new arrivals, who brought different cultural practices. Embargoes limited exports, while foreign direct investment remained scarce. Despite the hardship, political elites in the north insisted on their separate identity. Throughout the 1980s, United Nations envoys shuffled between Nicosia, Ankara, and Athens, proposing confidence-building measures. Ideas included partial reopening of the ghost city Varosha near Famagusta, joint committees on education, and cross-border visits for families. Yet each proposal fell victim to mutual suspicion, overshadowed by the memory of 1974 and the fear of repeating old mistakes. Across the island, civil society groups emerged, bridging the divide. Bicommunal concerts, art exhibitions, and workshops tried to cultivate understanding. These grassroots efforts, while small, offered glimpses of a shared desire for peace. Nevertheless, they struggled against official narratives that portrayed the other community as the primary obstacle. International powers showed inconsistent interest. Britain, a guarantor, remained passive. The United States, juggling Cold War priorities, occasionally urged compromise but rarely pressured either side. The European community signaled that Cyprus's membership could hinge on resolving the conflict, hinting at rewards if unity was found. But the promise of Europe seemed distant. By 1990, a generation had grown up in a divided Cyprus. For young people on both sides, the other side was often a rumor, a place of fear or curiosity glimpsed across checkpoints. Diplomatic inertia hardened the status quo into something normal. Neither side recognized the other's government. Each maintained separate institutions, passports, and identity. Still, the dream of a unified island refused to die. Talks in the early 1990s would spark new hopes, but after decades of stalemate and repeated disappointments, few dared to believe in a breakthrough. The conflict had become part of the island's very fabric, a partition woven into daily life, waiting for a day when division might give way to peace.